Long before modern ideas of religious freedom, belief was inseparable from power. In the ancient world, faith was not merely a private conviction. It was a declaration of political loyalty, cultural identity, and obedience to the state. When Christianity began spreading beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, it unknowingly stepped into one of history's most dangerous fault lines, the centuries-long rivalry between Rome and Persia. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Rome and Persia stood as the two superpowers of the known world. Their borders stretched across vast territories, their armies clashed repeatedly, and their emperors viewed one another with deep suspicion. Yet it was not only land and wealth that divided them, it was worldview. Rome, after centuries of persecuting Christians itself, had begun a dramatic transformation. With Emperor Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, Christianity shifted from a persecuted sect to a favored and eventually dominant religion of the Roman state. This change sent shockwaves far beyond Rome's borders. For the Persian Empire, ruled by the Sassanian dynasty, the rise of Christianity was not just a religious development, it was a geopolitical threat. Persia's official faith was Zoroastrianism, a religion closely tied to royal authority, law, and cosmic order. The Persian king was seen as divinely appointed, the guardian of truth against chaos. To reject the state religion was to challenge the moral foundation of the empire itself. As Christianity expanded eastward into Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Persia's frontier provinces, it carried an unavoidable association with Rome. To Persian officials, Christians were not neutral believers. They were followers of a Roman god, worshippers aligned with the enemy. Even when local Christians had never seen Rome and had no loyalty to the emperor, their faith alone marked them as suspect. This collision of empires turned belief into a liability. A Christian living under Persian rule could be accused not merely of heresy but of treason. Their prayers were seen as political statements. Their refusal to participate in Zoroastrian rituals was interpreted as rejection of Persian authority. In a world where unity of faith meant unity of state, Christianity represented dangerous disobedience. The situation worsened as Roman-Persian wars intensified. Each conflict deepened paranoia. Whenever Rome marched east or Persia pushed west, Christian communities found themselves trapped in the middle. Persian rulers feared that Christians might welcome Roman armies as liberators or act as informants. Even rumors of such sympathies were enough to justify brutal crackdowns. Unlike Rome's earlier persecutions of Christians, which were sporadic, localized, and often inconsistent, Persian responses became systematic. The Persian state viewed the issue not as religious dissent, but as national security. Christianity was treated as an invasive ideology tied to a hostile empire. This framing would justify extreme measures in the years to come. The irony was stark. While Rome gradually softened its stance and even embraced Christianity, Persia moved in the opposite direction. Roman Christians began building churches openly, serving in government, and shaping imperial policy. Persian Christians, meanwhile, were forced underground, gathering in secret, hiding scriptures and worshipping in fear. The same faith produced radically different fates depending on which side of the border one lived. For Persian rulers, the stakes felt existential. The Sassanian Empire defined itself as the protector of ancient traditions against foreign influence. Christianity, with its universal message and refusal to recognize divine kingship, directly undermined that vision. A Christian owed ultimate loyalty not to the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, but to a higher, unseen authority. That idea alone was intolerable to an empire built on sacred monarchy. As a result, when conflict erupted, Christians became convenient scapegoats. Economic hardship, military defeats, or political unrest were often blamed on divine displeasure supposedly caused by the presence of Christians who rejected the state gods. Persecution was framed as purification, a way to restore cosmic balance and imperial favor. Thus, the collision of empires transformed ordinary believers into targets. What began as a theological difference escalated into a matter of survival. Christianity was no longer just a faith, it was a perceived weapon of Rome, embedded deep within Persian society. This was the stage set for what followed. Once belief was equated with betrayal, mercy vanished. Captivity, torture, and execution were no longer excesses, they were policy. And, as the next chapters would reveal, the methods Persia employed against its Christian captives would grow so extreme that even Roman observers, hardened by centuries of violence, would record them with shock and disbelief. To understand why Persia's treatment of Christian captives became so severe, one must first understand fear, specifically the fear of infiltration. In the eyes of the Sassanian rulers, Christianity was not simply a foreign religion, it was a Trojan horse. It arrived not with armies, but with scriptures, not with banners, but with prayers. And yet, to Persian officials, it carried the unmistakable shadow of Rome. For centuries, Persia had defined itself in opposition to Rome. The two empires mirrored one another in power, ambition, and pride, locked in a rivalry that shaped the political map of the ancient world. When Rome adopted Christianity, the faith instantly became politicized beyond its spiritual meaning. What had once been a marginal sect now bore the seal of Rome's authority. To the Persians, this transformation was alarming. A religion that preached universal allegiance to one god now had the backing of their greatest enemy. Zoroastrianism, the state religion of Persia, was deeply intertwined with imperial identity. It taught a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. The Persian king was seen as the champion of order, ruling by divine favor. Any belief system that rejected this framework threatened not only theology, but governance itself. Christianity's refusal to acknowledge the divinity or sacred role of the Persian monarch struck at the heart of imperial legitimacy. More troubling still was Christianity's insistence on exclusive worship. Zoroastrianism tolerated ritual participation from subjects as a sign of loyalty, even if private beliefs varied. Christianity allowed no such compromise. Christians would not offer incense to Persian gods, would not participate in state rituals, and would not swear oaths invoking Zoroastrian deities. To Persian authorities, this was open defiance, silent but absolute. The fear intensified along Persia's western borders, where Christian communities flourished. Many of these believers spoke Syriac or Aramaic, not Latin or Greek, and had little cultural connection to Rome. Yet in the paranoid logic of empire, nuance did not matter. A Christian prayer, regardless of language, was seen as loyalty to Rome's god. The faith's sacred texts came from lands under Roman influence. Its bishops communicated across borders. Its theology flowed freely through trade routes that Persia could not fully control. Persian intelligence networks became increasingly suspicious of Christian clergy. Bishops were accused of serving as Roman agents, using religious gatherings to spread subversion. Monasteries were suspected of hiding messages. Even acts of charity were reinterpreted as attempts to win local loyalty away from the state. Fear turned ordinary religious life into supposed espionage. This anxiety reached a breaking point during periods of active war. When Roman and Persian armies clashed, Christian communities inside Persia were often the first to suffer retaliation. The logic was ruthless. If Christians shared faith with Rome, they must share its ambitions. Defeats on the battlefield were sometimes blamed on internal betrayal rather than military failure. Christians became convenient targets for imperial frustration. What made Christianity especially threatening was its endurance under persecution. Instead of disappearing, the faith often grew stronger when oppressed. Martyrdom narratives circulated secretly, inspiring others. To Persian rulers, this resilience looked less like devotion and more like fanaticism, proof that Christians were loyal to something beyond the empire's reach. The Sassanian court began to view Christianity as a contagion. Laws were enacted to limit church construction, restrict public worship, and punish conversion. Zoroastrian priests pressured the crown to act decisively, warning that tolerating Christianity would anger the gods and invite chaos. Religious fear and political fear merged into one. The idea of a Roman god became a powerful symbol in Persian propaganda. Christianity was portrayed as foreign, disloyal, and corrosive. Even native-born Persians who converted were accused of abandoning their ancestors and betraying the empire. Their faith erased their ethnicity in the eyes of the state. They were no longer Persian subjects, but potential enemies within. This mindset justified extraordinary cruelty. Once Christians were defined not as misguided believers, but as agents of a hostile power, harsh punishment became not only acceptable, but necessary. Captives were interrogated not about theology, but about allegiance. Renunciation of Christianity was framed as proof of loyalty to Persia. Refusal confirmed guilt. Ironically, this fear ignored reality. Most Persian Christians had no political ties to Rome and suffered under Roman rule in earlier generations, yet fear does not require truth, only plausibility. And in an age of constant war, the idea that Rome's influence could spread through belief alone was terrifying. Thus, Persia's fear of a Roman god hardened into policy. Christianity was no longer merely unwelcome. It was dangerous, and in that fear-driven atmosphere, compassion disappeared. What followed was a campaign of repression so brutal that even Rome, once infamous for its own persecutions, would recoil at the report, since Christianity was defined as a threat to Persian stability. There was no longer any distinction between belief and rebellion. For Christian captives under the Sassanian Empire, identity itself became a crime. They were no longer seen as civilians, prisoners of war, or even misguided subjects. They were branded as enemies of the crown, living proof, in the eyes of Persian authorities, that Rome's influence had seeped deep into Persian soil. This label changed everything. In the ancient world, captives were usually valuable. They could be ransomed, enslaved, exchanged, or absorbed into the empire. But Christian captives occupied a far more dangerous category. They were treated as ideological threats, not human assets. Their bodies were controlled, but their minds and loyalties were considered irredeemable unless forcibly reshaped. Interrogation was the first step. Christian captives were routinely questioned not about military movements, but about belief. Who baptized you? Who leads your congregation? Do you pray for the Roman emperor? These questions reveal the Persian mindset. Faith itself was assumed to be political allegiance. NY hesitation, any attempt to explain spiritual neutrality, was taken as deception. Public renunciation became the ultimate test of loyalty. Captives were ordered to worship Zoroastrian deities, participate in fire rituals, or curse Christ openly. Compliance was framed not as conversion, but as submission to the empire. Refusal marked the captive as a traitor beyond redemption. At that moment, mercy was no longer an option. Christian captives who resisted were often stripped of legal status. Once branded enemies of the crown, they lost protections normally granted to prisoners or subjects. Property could be confiscated, families could be separated. Even children were not spared suspicion, especially if they had been raised in the faith. Entire households could fall under scrutiny because one member refused to recant. What made this persecution especially severe was its bureaucratic nature. This was not random mob violence or isolated cruelty. Records indicate that officials documented confessions, refusals, and punishments. Clergy were catalogued, churches were mapped. The empire sought to uproot Christianity systematically, starting with those already under its control. Christian captives were often made examples of. Public trials and executions were staged not only to punish, but to warn. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to Christ meant hostility to Persia. By displaying suffering openly, the state hoped to terrorize others into obedience. Yet, these spectacles often had the opposite effect. Instead of deterring belief, they hardened it. Witnesses saw captives endure humiliation and pain without renouncing their faith. Stories spread quietly through villages and trade routes. In secret, these captives were remembered not as criminals, but as martyrs. The state's attempt to erase Christianity inadvertently gave it heroes. Persian authorities responded with harsher measures. Captives were isolated to prevent inspiration. Leaders were separated from followers. Some were forced into labor camps, mines, or border fortifications, places designed to exhaust the body and crush the spirit. Survival itself became a form of resistance. The cruelty extended beyond the individual. Families of captives were pressured relentlessly, wives were threatened, parents were told their children would be raised in Zoroastrian households. These tactics aimed to weaponize love against faith, forcing captives to choose between belief and those they cared for most. To the Persian state, this was not cruelty, it was necessity. An enemy within was more dangerous than one beyond the border. Roman armies could be repelled with steel, Christian conviction could not. The crown believed it was fighting for survival, and survival justified everything. What shocked later Roman observers was not just the brutality, but the logic behind it. Rome had persecuted Christians before, but often out of misunderstanding or fear of social disorder. Persia's actions were colder, more deliberate. Christian captives were not killed for refusing the gods alone. They were destroyed as symbols of foreign dominance. In Persian ideology, order depended on unity of belief. A divided faith meant a divided empire. Christian captives, by their mere existence, represented fracture. Branding them enemies of the crown transformed persecution into patriotism. Officials were not tormentors, they were guardians of the state. And yet, history would remember it differently. The very act of branding Christians as enemies exposed the empire's insecurity. It revealed how deeply belief could threaten power, and how fear could strip an empire of restraint. What Persia did to its Christian captives was not the act of a confident ruler, but of a crown haunted by the idea that faith alone could undo it. The Sassanian Empire's approach to dealing with Christian captives was not only severe, it was meticulously designed to terrify, humiliate, and break the human spirit. For historians and chroniclers, even those accustomed to the brutality of ancient Rome, the punishments inflicted upon Christians under Persian rule were shocking. Persia's methods were not merely about execution, they were psychological, symbolic, and ritualistic, aimed at demonstrating absolute dominance over body, mind, and soul. Unlike conventional warfare, where death was the primary instrument, Persian authorities understood that belief was more resilient than flesh. Christianity was growing stronger with each martyrdom, and the empire needed more than brute force to suppress it. Thus, punishments were designed to communicate a message. Loyalty to Persia demanded the rejection of the Christian God, and defiance would lead to unimaginable suffering. The empire treated Christian captives not as prisoners of war, but as existential threats. One of the most common forms of punishment was prolonged torture, administered with a calculated precision that blurred the line between punishment and spectacle. Captives were bound and suspended in positions that strained their muscles and joints, often for days at a time. They were flogged with whips designed to tear the skin in intricate patterns, leaving lasting scars as visible proof of their disobedience. Chroniclers describe how these tortures were performed in public spaces, marketplaces, city squares, and near temples, ensuring that the terror extended beyond the individual to the community at large. Fire was a frequent instrument of torment. Captives were sometimes branded with heated metal symbols, representing either Persian authority or pagan deities, intended to burn both flesh and faith simultaneously. Flames could also be used more directly, with victims exposed to smoke or small fires as part of ritualized humiliation. These punishments were carefully staged, often with priests and officials presiding, to reinforce the notion that defiance was a cosmic, moral, and political transgression. Water, a symbol of purity in Christian tradition, was sometimes inverted into a method of torture. Accounts describe captives being submerged in cold water for prolonged periods, beaten when they surfaced, or forced to endure near-drowning experiences repeatedly. The act was both physical and psychological, a perversion of a sacred element meant to communicate that the Persian state controlled even the elements that Christians revered. Psychological torment accompanied physical suffering. Captives were forced to witness the executions of their peers or the forced apostasy of friends and family. They were subjected to mock rituals designed to tempt them into renouncing their faith. The empire understood that fear, shame, and hopelessness could sometimes achieve what brute force could not. Captives were often confronted with offers of wealth, freedom, or position in exchange for abandonment of their beliefs. Refusal meant prolonged and increasingly cruel punishment, reinforcing the idea that persistence in faith was itself a crime. Some methods were particularly symbolic, crafted to attack the very identity of the captive. Hair and beards were shaved, clothing torn, and sacred items confiscated. Captives might be paraded in chains, forced to wear symbols of shame, or compelled to perform menial labor as a form of public degradation. These acts were designed to strip individuals of their dignity, erasing their personal and religious identity before the eyes of their community. Even death was executed with ritualistic intent. Beheadings, impalements, and crucifixions were staged to maximize visibility and impact. In many accounts, victims were executed slowly, their deaths prolonged to ensure that their suffering became a lesson for others. Chroniclers suggest that the Sassanian Empire's cruelty was so methodical that it could almost be described as ceremonial, a grim theater where the state wielded absolute authority over life, death, and belief. The symbolic nature of these punishments also extended to their locations. Christian captives were often executed near Zoroastrian fire temples or in places associated with imperial power, reinforcing the narrative that defiance was not only an offense against the crown but also against divine order. Each punishment, therefore, became a public lesson, an object lesson in the consequences of disloyalty. Interestingly, even Roman observers who had witnessed gladiatorial games, crucifixions, and the bloody spectacles of the Colosseum were horrified by Persian methods. Roman chroniclers repeatedly emphasized the methodical, intentional, and symbolic cruelty of the Sassanian Empire. Where Roman punishment was often designed to entertain or maintain civic order, Persian torture and execution were systematic and ideologically driven, aimed at annihilating faith itself. This methodical cruelty had a paradoxical effect. While it instilled fear and temporarily subdued some communities, it also created a lasting legacy of martyrdom. Stories of courage under torture spread across borders, inspiring Christians both within and beyond Persia. The empire's attempt to eradicate belief paradoxically strengthened it. Witnesses recorded the steadfastness of captives, noting how faith endured even under conditions designed to destroy hope. These narratives would circulate through letters, manuscripts, and oral tradition, ensuring that the memory of Persian cruelty endured for centuries. Furthermore, the Sassanian approach to punishment was tightly bound to political control. It was not enough to kill. Captives had to be publicly humiliated, their loyalty questioned, and their communities terrorized into compliance. Every act of cruelty was intended to reinforce the perception of an all-powerful state, capable of regulating not only life and death, but thought, conscience, and spiritual allegiance. In the end, Persia's treatment of Christian captives represented an intersection of fear, ideology, and political calculation. It was cruelty elevated to a science, designed to intimidate, coerce, and break not just bodies, but belief itself. And while Rome had earned its reputation for brutality, the Sassanian Empire's methods, symbolic, ritualized, and relentless, crossed a line that even Roman chroniclers found shocking. Christianity survived, as it often did, because faith proved more resilient than terror. But the legacy of Persia's punishments endured as a chilling example of how empires, when guided by fear and suspicion, could attempt to wield control over the most intimate and unassailable aspects of human life, belief, conscience, and loyalty to God. Even as the Sassanian Empire's campaigns against Christian captives grew increasingly brutal, much of their story was deliberately erased from history. Unlike wars between empires where armies leave traces in chronicles, inscriptions, and monuments, the persecution of Christians under Persia often occurred in secret or under conditions intended to leave no witnesses. The empire sought to obliterate not only the captives, but also the memory of their suffering. What survived, therefore, comes from scattered accounts, hidden manuscripts, and the testimonies of observers who were both outsiders and insiders, chronicling events at great personal risk. Persia's erasure of these events was systematic. Unlike the Roman Empire, which documented its triumphs and defeats openly, the Sassanian state maintained secrecy regarding internal policy toward religious minorities. Torture chambers, prisons, and execution sites were deliberately removed from public scrutiny, except in the cases where officials wanted to stage fear. Even then, records were rarely kept for posterity. The goal was immediate compliance, not historical legacy. Many Christians were executed quietly, their deaths known only to family members or fellow believers who survived in hiding. This silence was compounded by the passage of time. Christian communities under Persian rule were fragmented, forced to practice their faith in secret. Churches were destroyed, monasteries abandoned, and sacred texts hidden or lost. Oral traditions preserved fragments of events, but even these were vulnerable. Families were dispersed, martyrs' stories were suppressed by fear, and scribes risked execution if they documented persecution. As a result, entire episodes of cruelty vanished, leaving gaps in the historical record that later generations struggled to reconstruct. What remains of these stories often comes from Roman chroniclers and Christian hagiographies. These accounts, written after the fact, are colored by perspective and purpose, to inspire faith, to memorialize the martyrs, and to warn against forgetfulness. While some details may be exaggerated or romanticized, the underlying reality is clear. Persia's treatment of Christian captives was so extreme that contemporaries recognized it as shocking, even by the standards of an era accustomed to brutality. The silence is also cultural. Persia did not celebrate its suppression of Christians. Such acts were considered unpleasant but necessary measures to maintain order and loyalty. Unlike victories in battle, which could be immortalized in inscriptions or reliefs, the persecution of religious minorities was not a source of pride for the empire. Therefore, deliberate omission from official records contributed to the sense that history itself had tried to bury these events. Despite these efforts, traces endured. Secret letters smuggled across borders, clandestine copies of martyr lists, and oral histories preserved in Christian communities all maintain the memory of what occurred. Monks, scribes, and priests risked their lives to ensure that the names of the faithful were remembered, writing accounts of tortures, interrogations, and steadfast faith that would later inform historians. These fragments form the foundation of modern understanding, even as many details remain lost. The erasure was so effective that for centuries, the sheer extent of Persia's persecution of Christians was underestimated. Early historians focused on Roman history, on battles and emperors, rarely acknowledging the suffering that occurred beyond the empire's borders. Only with careful study of Eastern manuscripts, Syriac texts, and archaeological evidence did scholars begin to grasp the scale of the oppression. Even now, many accounts remain inaccessible or untranslated, leaving gaps in the narrative that hint at horrors almost too extreme to comprehend. One of the most disturbing aspects of this buried history is how ordinary citizens were caught between political fear and survival. Families of Christians faced a choice: conceal faith and endure in secrecy, or expose loved ones to state wrath. Children grew up learning to hide their beliefs, communities adapted secret rituals and hidden meeting places. This daily negotiation between life, faith, and compliance created a culture of silence that perpetuated the empire's control while also protecting the essence of belief. The Persian strategy of erasure also highlights a paradox. By attempting to eliminate memory, the empire inadvertently enhanced the mystique of Christian martyrdom. Stories of captives who refused to renounce their faith, who endured torture and execution in silence, circulated among survivors as tales of extraordinary courage. Each act of defiance, though intended to intimidate, became a moral and spiritual lesson. In this way, the very efforts to silence Christians ensured that their resilience would echo far beyond Persia's borders. Moreover, the silence forced future historians to read between the lines. Archaeological evidence of destruction, Fragments of letters and manuscripts and accounts from neighboring regions became crucial for reconstructing events. Scholars piecing together these narratives often find a pattern: Christian communities systematically targeted, imprisoned, tortured, and executed, yet always surviving in some form. The Sassanian Empire's attempt to erase these stories was thus incomplete, leaving a haunting legacy that speaks to both cruelty and human resilience. Finally, the silence surrounding Persia's treatment of Christian captives serves as a reminder of the fragility of historical memory. Entire episodes of suffering can vanish if not documented, and voices of the oppressed risk being permanently lost. The fact that any record survived is a testament to the courage of those who refuse to be silenced. Through their fragmented testimonies, the modern world gains insight into a period when belief itself could mark one as an enemy of the state, and when empires sought not only to control land, but the very souls of their subjects. In conclusion, Persia's attempt to erase the persecution of Christian captives demonstrates both the power of empire and the endurance of memory. What was meant to vanish into obscurity instead left traces that persist to this day, revealing a chapter of human suffering so extreme that it shocked even contemporaries accustomed to brutality. These silenced stories, once uncovered, testify not only to the cruelty of power, but to the unbreakable resilience of faith, and they serve as a haunting reminder of what history sometimes tries to hide.